shout out if you can't see everything. So this is the review section for the exam 1 and lab practical 1 that's due this week. And we had a morning session earlier on, and I had 2 students there, and now we have a couple here in the evening session. And I think I'll do one more on our normal meeting time on Wednesday mornings, but it's going to be the same content in all of those. So of course I'm happy to see people and I enjoy that, but don't feel like there's not going to be anything new that you have to arrange things. And I think we probably might have a look if we need to add another session for another time. I think that Wednesday morning is not ideal for everyone. So I'm kind of all about democracy. The ones who are here, they've got to vote, and we'll just make the decision based on that. But like I had before, I'm going to try to do a little bit of a structure to this, whereas even though there's a structure, the main goal for me is that you get all the answers that you want. Anything that's confusing you, anything that you feel that we didn't quite cover that to that detail, or how much should I know about this and that, we'll get those covered. So that's just kind of a quick overview, but what I was hoping to achieve today. And really the main focus will be on getting you ready for the exam 1 and lab practical 1. I wanted to start, like, this is really just let's all be happy approach. I just wanted to start because I have to always look at that. Where am I in the semester and how much more I have left? By noting that we're almost 1 quarter done with the semester by the end of this week. Isn't it crazy? Yeah, I get confused that where has the time gone? But really, when you've taken the first exam and you've taken the first lab practical, you have about a quarter of all the points in the pocket already. And I try to make these exams and have multiple of those so that there's low stakes, that you don't feel like everything's riding on one exam. So that's the reason. But I was really hyped. I was like, oh, we're getting there, because a lot of these other topics are a little bit more straightforward than the endocrine system. I feel that that's the most horrible one to start with. We freak you out, and then when we start doing, it turns out that you all know so much about other systems that you'll be totally fine. But let's have a look. I also wanted to, that was from the last week, just show that we had the assignments as before. However, this week we do not have anything else than the exam and the lab practical 1. So that's all you have to do. There's no weekly assignments as such. However, I do want to mention, I get it that this is kind of a new platform, new way of doing things for many students. I also get it that the beginning of the semester is crazy. I'm the first one to raise my hand and say that I'm barely getting through the day. So I would not be upset if someone said, and I have had few students already saying that, oh, I wasn't able to do this assignment and I really wanted to do it. I'm totally open to reopen assignments for you. I'm totally open of resetting an assignment for you, setting you an extension. If there's something that you missed or you feel that you didn't do as well as you could, all I need from you is clear details that what that assignment is. Because when students say that, oh, it was this one lab, and I'm like, oh, there's so many labs, and I'm not really the best at staying focused. I'm not going to go through all of those labs, because by the time I've got into the 3rd lab, something shiny goes past me and I'm gone. So just let me know. We can do it either through email or course messages or as a one-on-one meeting. If there's technical issues, that's usually the easiest way to do it, the kind of sitting down and having a look at what part of the assignment isn't loading. I have to say I use a lot of different platforms, since this is not my main gig. This is like my side hustle. So I do end up also sometimes having to sit down and having to figure out that what did Connect do in this book version versus the previous book version. So it's figuring out for me as well. But what I want is that you get a chance to get all of those points, because even though they're small points, they all actually end up adding up. It's like little streams and they add up. And when you have those little points collected, you have less at stake on the exams. You can kind of be like, oh, I'm in a pretty good space for that. So just let me know. It's not like you've missed a chance if something has gone. That's all I'm wanting to put out there. And I'm wanting to make sure that everyone hears it. So I'm repeating myself. I see thumbs up. I'm really, really glad about that. Excellent. So this week's what we've got scheduled and what's our goal is that we complete by the end of the week. And I believe that that's 1 minute before midnight, which is like really strange time, but it's because of how the system is set up, that we complete before end of the week, exam 1 and lab practical 1. And as you see, the exam 1 is worth of 100 points. The lab practical is half of that. So there's some points to be gained on that. And I did build the exam just this weekend. And after I had built it, I wrote this review guide. So really everything is there. There's no curveballs. Sometimes we do that one instructor writes one thing and then we share it. And then there can be surprises for me as well. But that's not the case this time around at all. So it's not a killer exam. It's really, you have time. It's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing weird. It's just 50 questions, 2 points for each question. And there's different kinds. Some are just true or false statements. Some are multiple choice questions. I have tried to throw in a few different ones. And I have a very generous extra credit question there as well. And we'll talk about that today on this review thing. So I want, if you've shown up here, you have all the tools to get 110% of the exam. That's what I aim for. My students are always confused that how can you have that sort of grades? But in my class, you can. And then we have the lab practical. That's actually something that a colleague of mine set it up for us. She wanted that we have a similar setup for everyone. It's Dr. Greer. You've seen her videos on when there's the anatomy of whatever it is, endocrine anatomy or anatomy of blood, those videos that she has recorded, really all they are pictures of various structures. And then you write what you see, what is it? And they are graded. I will manually go through every single answer. So if there's spelling errors, capitalization errors, or hyphens or whatever, I will totally accept anything as long as it's close to what it should be. So sometimes when we do these online things, it turns into more of a game of how do you deal with the intelligence behind it in terms of that a single letter typed wrong doesn't give you 0 marks. There's nothing to worry about that on the lab practical. So just if you don't know exactly, tell me something. That's what I tell my face-to-face students always. If you don't even know the structure, tell me something. I can give you some points for something. Cats are usually good topics to tell about, but I do prefer if it's related somehow to the structure that we're looking at. So that's the big picture and the big goal for today. What I really would like us to do is to go through the study guide. I don't know, did you guys have a chance to look it up? I uploaded it only this month. I get it that it was a little last minute of me as well, but I wanted to make sure that it's up to date. Did you find it on the Blackboard or Canvas? I don't even remember what learning management I'm using. On the Canvas, did you both find the study guide?
Not yet, but I can look right now.
Yeah, go and have a look because it's going to help you to kind of know where to find.
I know, I've seen it. I just have not gone through it.
Don't worry. If you've seen it,
okay,
you're good.
I've seen there's videos too, right?
There's, I think there's sort of a review video of or there's study guides at least of the exam and then about the labs, but I don't think that there's really a study video as such for this week's month.
Okay.
But if you can find this,
I saw a whole bunch of stuff that I gotta be looking at.
Okay. I would encourage you to have a look of that and pull it up, because what you'll notice that it's a little different from what many people are used to of a study guide to be. In my study guides, there's gaps. And when there's a gap, it's probably an important thing. Like I'm really learning style that if you write it, you remember it better than just seeing it. But you don't have to print it. You can use it any way you wish. I'm just very tactile. I'm very learned by doing procedures. So I have to have that in front of me. But some of these don't always make sense. And they're more of just to have that conversation and thinking going, that what would be things that we want to think on this. So what we'll go through this, and you can keep it next to your table when you're taking the exam. And every answer is going to be on that. Because I said what we're going to do for the next hour, we're going to cover every single question. So remember that exam questions are from those lecture videos that you watched. Nothing outside doors, nothing from the labs, nothing from the Learn Smart. It's all from those lecture videos. And you've seen that my lecture videos are kind of simple. I'm a simple guy, so I have to keep it simple. So there's nothing that I would ask you to do that I wouldn't be willing to do myself. And I'm really not trying to catch you on any tricky questions. So what we'll do, we'll go through the material by using this study guide. So I'm going to try to be good at this and switch into the PowerPoint, from the PowerPoint to the PDF of the study guide. Are you able to see it on the screen? Excellent. Study guide for the exam 1. And if you do want to take notes, you can. This video will be also available as a recording. And that's why I want to keep up that we don't go for 3 hours. So you actually have a chance of wanting to watch it again. If it's super long, no one wants to watch that for that long. And I definitely wouldn't want to be listening myself for so long. So as you'll see, I started, and if you think of back on the day when we first started this course, we started with the endocrine system. And one of the big themes that I wanted just as a starter of the course to highlight was that all systems really are linked to other systems. And this is especially true in endocrine system, that whenever we're studying another system later or earlier on these AMP classes, we'll notice that there's some hormonal stuff involved there. So really, I feel that often teaching the endocrine system or students learning it, it feels like you've just covered half of the story. So don't feel bad. We're going to get rest of the story later on. And it's a little bit depending on how we classify. Do we combine certain elements or do we keep them separate? That how many body systems do we actually find? Some have different numbers for that. But what I want you to get out of that intro was just that endocrine system plays a role in all of these. And shout out at any stage if you have questions, if you want to make comments, anything like that. After that, I mentioned that there are 2 control systems in the body. One of them was the nervous system, and one of them was the endocrine system. And we covered the nervous system at the end of the BIO201. And we saw that nervous system was very, very different from what we have now learned that endocrine system is. So what I want us to be able to do is to realize that both have the same function of passing messages, but how they do it differs. And sometimes these 2 are not separate. Sometimes they actually function at the same time. Sometimes they are separate, but really this is just an artificial way of looking at it. So we remember nervous system was all about action potentials, right? That sounds kind of familiar and rings bells. So these were these electrical impulses that traveled within the neurons. And if we think of action potentials, they're really fast. But they also, once they're gone, they're gone. They last only a short amount of time. So nervous control of things in the body is very immediate. And then it disappears. So it's quick, fast, but also short-lasting. Whereas the hormones, the endocrine system, which we were looking on this chapter, because hormones are circulated through the blood, it takes a little bit time for these hormones to reach where they need to go. So it is much slower than the nervous system. But the hormones are also going to be around in that blood for a while. Some short time can be days. For some, short time can be weeks. But there's a significant difference if you compare that to the nervous system, where we're talking of parts of seconds. So endocrine system instead is much slower to act, but its effects are lasting for much longer time in the body. So I think it's a good idea kind of connecting what we've seen before, thinking of this, and then realizing that these both still aim for the same thing, passing messages. Are we good with that? And if I'm going too fast, also give me a shout out. I'm just looking up, nodding, and kind of like, as long as no one looks distressed, then I'm good. And like I said, you will have all of these videos available. I think it's always good to cover a little bit of terminology, because if you have a multiple choice question exam, that's quite common, that there's some sort of a terminology that we cover, and that there's terms that sound like right, but they're not quite right. So when we're talking about study of hormones, study of those organs that produce hormones, study of those organs that respond to hormones, and what those hormones really are, how they come about, how they disappear, how do we take them away, how do we regulate them, that all is a field of endocrinology. So in A&P, when you learn one word, you can milk it to the death. If you know endocrine system, you know that anything that sounds a little bit like that, we're talking about hormones. So that's just the kind of intro that what field we are talking about. And endocrine system served many, many purposes. I think this list that I have here about functions, these were just functions that I could come up like this from my head. There's plenty of other functions as well, so you don't need to take these as the only proper functions that exist for the endocrine system. They're just examples, but they're examples that are obvious when we think of hormones. Reproduction, for example. Males and females are different, but really males and females are different because of the hormones that are present. So that's a good example of the functions that hormones serve, the reproduction. Also regulating, I think, female menstrual cycle and then salvaging and carrying through the pregnancy. In terms of hormonal regulation, that's the most finely tuned machine I've ever seen. And as a guy, I'm just like, oh, it's amazing how it all works. And we'll cover that at the very end of our course when we talk about male and female reproductive systems. The other good example about hormones is when we talk about growth and development. After a baby is born, in relation to the size of the baby actually grows a lot in a very short amount of time. And not just that there's physical growth, but there's development, learning of things, fine-tuning skills. So that's a period when we have a lot of hormones around in the individual. But there's another time which kind of helps me to remember that growth and development is important for hormonal system. And that's when a youngster goes through their teens and goes through the puberty. You know, we've all been at some stage teenagers. I don't say that others are, but I certainly was very much reacting to various changes in hormones. Could not predict what sort of a mood I had. So that's a good example that while we go through that growth spurt during the teenage years, during the teenage years, that's when the growth hormones and other hormones are in great quantities in the body. There's other examples that I put, for example, maintaining functions. Well, the water maintenance is, for example, an important one. With the water goes the electrolytes and so on. All this happens through the blood. Remember, hormones act through the blood. So that's just there, kind of to remind us of that. Regulating many different things, regulating the energy production, regulating the energy, how we distribute it, how we distribute our energy resources. Are we saving them? Are we kind of going in and tipping into some storages of energy? All that controlled by the hormones. And of course, body defenses. We want to stay safe. We want to get rid of any pathogens, any invaders that might be coming to the body. Hormonal system plays an important role on that as well. But don't feel like, oh, I don't remember every one of those. Those were just examples to get us thinking of what the hormones do. But this next one is an important one, and I do have a question about that in the exam, because although our function and our interest on this chapter is the endocrine system, the hormones, I think we need to know the difference between different kinds of glands that we have. So we have something known as exocrine glands, and then we have our endocrine glands. Endocrine glands were all about hormones. But what are these exocrine glands then? Well, I think the easiest way to kind of learn the similarities and differences is by looking at examples. So we have certain glands that we all know. We have sweat glands on the skin, or we have tear glands that then open up to the tear duct on the eye. We have 3 different salivary glands that we have. They all produce some kind of a secretion, but this secretion doesn't go to the blood like a hormone would go. Instead, through local ducts, they open fairly close to that gland. So they're acting locally, and their secretions are directed to that local site where they need to act. So these are the exocrine glands, glands that we often think of when we talk about glands in the body. Endocrine glands were a little different. Now we don't have ducts because they dump all of their secretions to the blood flow. They don't really worry that is my secretions now going exactly where it needs to go, because the strategy is that let's dump it everywhere and it will find its way where it needs to go. And these distances between endocrine gland and where we want the action to happen can be long. Whereas on the exocrine glands, these distances are fairly short because the ducts have to be only of a certain length. So endocrine gland secretions can act anywhere in the body. They travel throughout the body in the bloodstream. And then pretty much all the glands that we're going to talk moving on from now are examples of endocrine glands. Does that difference kind of make sense? Yeah, I see a little bit nodding. I know that it's a basic concept, but that's a concept that's easy to forget because we get so zoomed into one system. And then you're like, oh, there's other kinds of glands than endocrine glands. So I really want you to know that difference. And there are going to be at least a couple of questions of those in the exam. I think that the examples are good ones to kind of have an idea that if you got a list of different kinds of glands, that, oh, could you tell which ones would be examples of exocrine, which ones would be examples of endocrine? And really remember, it's an open book exam. So again, the key is more of to know where to go for the information if you don't remember it. You will not be able to Google every single question because then you'll be Googling forever. But a lot of these, don't stress, don't worry. You will have the answers. You just need to know, kind of have a gut feeling of what you're expecting to see. And the questions that I put out there, they're not difficult. I only have one tricky question, and I'm going to tell you when it comes up when we're reviewing this. And that's just me using a term that sounds like something else. So that's the difference between endocrine and exocrine gland. And you know that as biology teachers, we always get excited when there's something that's different from what normally happens. And what's different is pancreas. Pancreas is an odd, very weird organ because it's both endocrine and exocrine. That doesn't often happen, but this one in particular is a good example that the same gland serves both of these purposes. The exocrine function, which we don't worry about in this chapter, however, we will be looking at the exocrine function of the pancreas when we talk about digestive system later on this course. But the exocrine function is really to produce digestive juice. That digestive juice is known as pancreatic juice, and it's the most complete digestive juice in the digestive system and all that. But we'll talk about that later. All you need to know that in that case, the pancreas, where it's located, it dumps its contents very close to where it is located through a duct. So it's very local where the pancreas acts. Whereas the endocrine function of the pancreas, that's all to do with the hormones. And there's two important hormones that we want to know. We want to know insulin and we want to know glucagon. Those two are what we use to regulate blood sugar levels. And normally when you ask about the hormone of the pancreas, the endocrine example of a hormone of the pancreas, everyone thinks of insulin. Glucagon is just as important. And if I was a mean person trying to come up with a very challenging exam question, this is the hardest exam question that there is. Honestly, it's this easy. I would probably ask glucagon rather than insulin as an example of a hormone from pancreas, because there's going to be other hormones that we're going to be talking later on that sound a little similar. And then I'd be like, oh, maybe I managed to confuse them. But no, remember that glucagon is still all about blood sugar level regulation. You can think of the glucose. That's what we're dealing with. So going back to those introductory bio classes, 181 or 156 or whatever. But really, that's all you need to know at this point of the endocrine and exocrine glands. The next page that I had is something that you've seen before. And you've seen it when we talked about the endocrine system. I had the diagram of the human body, and then I had various explanations of different glands, what they do. So if you already have that, that's great. If you don't have it, you will find this also the completed version on the endocrine systems module. And this is really what I would use. Sorry, I'm kind of like trying to think, how do I turn it? I'm just afraid if I turn it elsewhere, then I'll never turn it back. But basically what we're seeing, I can open it up from here. What we're seeing is that it summarizes everything that you need to know about. Can you see this one? Yes. So don't try to write it all down now. It summarizes everything that we will be talking during this review session. And this is as a colored version available there on that module for you. But I think if I was taking an exam and I knew that I would have a chance to have notes on the table, this could be one of the notes that I would want to have close to me because it summarizes everything from that chapter. But again, the reason why I added it here is that if I was a student and I was studying and I would feel totally comfortable with that diagram, now I would have it again and I could kind of try to fill it in from memory, that how much do I remember? And then if I don't remember something, I could still look it up and write, because more times I write, better I learn. But that's just my learning style. You might have a different way, but I'm just trying to throw out those examples for you, how you could tackle that. So we'll go through this and you have that available there in the week 2 module. I had to count back. It shouldn't be that hard. We've only done 4 weeks, but it feels longer, don't it? So let's have a look what I have next. We'll go back to this one. On the next page, I have 2 glands that I've dedicated a whole page for. All other glands, they're going to be condensed in 2 pages that come after this. But 2 glands are so important that I've taken them apart from all of the other material, and I wanted us to have a chance to look at those. So those are our hypothalamus and pituitary gland. And these were the 2 that were kind of in charge of the entire business. You remember that hypothalamus received nerve impulses from the brain, And it's often referred as the master gland. And the reason why it's called master gland is that it pretty much controls all other glands, all other endocrine glands in the body. So that oversees and sends the signals that activates or deactivates the hormones from those. So it's the kind of a overall big boss of the entire system. But hypothalamus is physically connected to the pituitary gland through this little bridge-like structure. And that bridge-like structure was, of course, our infundibulum. And I'm, again, trying to think of, did I spell it correctly or not? If I misspelled it, don't feel that I would deduct points from anyone. Sometimes it is a little bit of that British spelling is different, but this one is probably just me being a bad speller. But that's a structure that's kind of a bridge-looking structure that connects two structures. We'll see this term being used elsewhere in the body at later times, but right now, this is the only place where we're using this term as a connection between hypothalamus and pituitary. And pituitary gland then wasn't that simple. Pituitary gland was one of the hardest ones that we had because pituitary gland was divided into two. We had posterior lobe and we had anterior lobe. And the difference, it's not just physiological, it's also anatomical difference, that when we actually look at the pituitary gland, we can see those two lobes. And I think we're going to start with the posterior lobe because that's easy. And that's really quick to go through. So posterior lobe of pituitary gland receives signals from hypothalamus directly. So these messages come directly to the posterior lobe. And these messages can be neural, so through nerve cells. They can also be hormonal in certain instances. But there's two hormones that are released from the posterior lobe. And these two hormones that I would like you to know in your mind that you can think of, oh, posterior pituitary, these are the two hormones that I think of, are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, ADH. So oxytocin, let's think of what oxytocin does. And one of the concepts that we're going to have look of later on, and that's a concept that if you're ever taking a course with me, you know that I'm going to talk about it. It's the homeostasis and homeostatic mechanism. That's just such a fundamental theme and fundamental concept in all of the biology that always comes up. But we see that normally homeostasis works through negative feedback. So if we have a certain range where we want things to be and we're starting to deviate from that, the homeostasis brings it back within that range. So it's negative. It eliminates the change that would normally happen. So that's negative feedback. And there's only 3 instances where we see positive feedback in the body. And oxytocin is one of those. So what oxytocin does, that when we are in the middle of giving birth to a child, or we're at the very beginning of the childbirth, the child's head starts to push against the uterine wall lining, and that causes the uterine wall lining to be stretched, and there's stretch receptors there, and we're sensing that, oh, hey, something's wanting to come out from here. Well, this signal is sensed, passed to the control center, which was our brain, and instead of what we normally would do, which would be that let's stop it from happening, because it's now positive feedback, we say that, yeah, let's get that baby out. So we start to release even more oxytocin, which causes even more pressure, even more spreading to the uterus, which helps the baby eventually to come out. So it's kind of a circle, self-fulfilling prophecy that then starts happening. That's the example of positive feedback. The other example with the positive feedback there that oxytocin is taking part on is lactation. So when the newborn is sucking on the nipple, that releases oxytocin, which causes milk to be released, which when that happens, again promotes more oxytocin to be released, which causes even more milk to be released. So the sucking of the baby, of the nipple, starts that process. And again, it's positive feedback because we're making it more and more and more rather than what we would normally do, try to stop it from happening. So oxytocin is a good example of that. The other example from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is known as ADH. And really the clue is again in the name, antidiuretic hormone. I just ran out of space, so I've abbreviated it there. But what we are doing, we are not wanting to urinate. It's anti-urination hormone. So this hormone, when we release that from the posterior pituitary gland, we're wanting to hold fluids in the body and not make as much pee as we normally would do. And there would be a very good reason for that. The kidneys don't really function to make pee. They function to regulate the amount of fluid in the body. So if we are getting dehydrated, for example, we don't want to lose more fluids from our body. Well, if we were dehydrated, your posterior pituitary would be secreting ADH, which then would cause kidneys to work to maintain as much fluids. So urination would go down. Maintain as much fluids as possible. So that's the two hormones from the posterior lobe. Do we feel okay about those? Awesome. I'm glad. I love that thumbs up. Like I really literally communicate like that on text messages. My goal is once to have a discussion with just those picture symbols. I still haven't been able to do it, but I try one day. One day. So when you get strange emails from me, you know why that is. No, I'm just kidding. So let's have a look at the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And it looks like there's much more going on, but really this is quite a quick one to go through. So anterior lobe does not react directly to the hypothalamus. It receives its messages from the posterior pituitary gland. So there's an extra step there. So all the messages went to the posterior, and from there, some of them continue to the anterior, which now causes anterior pituitary gland to release certain hormones. And let's have a look at what kind of hormones do we have there. The first one, GH, is growth hormone. Well, what does growth hormone do? It helps you to grow bigger. It's really not that secret what it does. So that's again when we talked about during early life, after you're born, you're growing a lot. At that stage, we find that baby has a lot of growth hormones in its blood. But we also find that during the puberty, during the teenage years, there's great amounts of growth hormones. So we see that growth spurt. Sometimes we get athletes who want to get bigger and bulkier and grow muscles, grow physically bigger. They might actually take synthetic growth hormone. And yes, it does help them to grow, but it comes with a cost of many potential issues that can come out of that. So we don't recommend that, and I think that it's not allowed in most sports anyways. Another time when you might have heard about growth hormones, and I don't know, because I haven't lived all my life here in America, is that sometimes, at least in the past, it was done that we gave for certain animals that were grown for food, growth hormones. So they would grow as big and as meaty as possible because we want to eat that nice flesh. That is becoming less and less common. That's considered quite unethical. That's considered also quite bad for those animals. So we don't really see growth hormone being used on the food production industry anymore that much. But it could be used. So I'm just throwing it if it helps you to remember that out there. Then we have a bunch of hormones that name tells exactly what they do. We have TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. What could it do? Well, it stimulates thyroid. Adrenal gland hormone. What could it do? Well, it stimulates adrenal gland. So those are just literally showing how we have this hypothalamus pituitary axis that then controls all other glands. Then The next two ones are interesting ones because they again relate to the female reproductive cycle and menstrual cycle. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone and LH stands for luteinizing hormone. These two hormones regulate the normal menstrual cycle, and you'll actually see day by day their amounts and how their amounts in the blood alters the changes that we see, for example, in the uterine lining and development of the egg cell, maturation of the egg cell as well, when we cover the female reproductive system at the very end of this course. But for now, all you need to know is that follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, they control the menstrual cycle in females. And the last one that we have, prolactin, is a hormone also secreted from anterior pituitary gland. What could it do? Lactin, well, that tells us that we're talking about lactation. We're in favor of lactation. So prolactin promotes lactation. So there's actually two hormones that act on the lactation. One from posterior lobe, or oxytocin, and one from the anterior lobe, the prolactin. And now again, if I was really trying to come up with a difficult question for the exam, I could make, for example, a statement where I said that prolactin is the only hormone that regulates lactation, and it's secreted from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. That statement, of course, would be wrong, because now you know that both posterior and anterior lobe contribute to the lactation. So you would be able to get points for that statement really easy. Go for it. You were happy with that. Yeah.
Say that one more time.
So what we want to know, what could come up as an exam question, I could make a statement and I'm asking you to choose, is it true or false? And that statement could, for example, say that prolactin is the only hormone in the body that regulates lactation, and it's secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. Well, now you know that no, that cannot be true. There's two hormones, one from posterior lobe and one from anterior lobe. So that statement has to be wrong. So that's just to give hint what could come up. I'm going to tell you, there is a question like that. Yeah. So this is the two important ones that we needed to know in terms of the glands. And rest of the glands that I have listed, I have just listed them in alphabetical order. So it's no popularity contest. It's no that which one is more important, which one is not. And the first one that we'll have a look is the adrenal gland. And it may look like there's a lot of stuff going on with the adrenal gland, but there really isn't. It just looks that way because there's two separate parts to it. So adrenal glands are these small pyramid-shaped structures on top of the kidneys. And if you hear that we talk about adrenal gland, what do we think that adrenal gland could be doing? Producing adrenaline, right? And adrenaline was all to do with these fight or flight responses, the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So when you get that surge or rush of adrenaline, well, that gland probably is involved in that. But that's kind of the general overview view. Let's have a look a little bit more into what's happening with the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands can be divided into two parts. We have cortex, and you remember from when we talked about the brain at the end of 201, cortex was the outer layer of the brain. Well, cortex is used to describe outer layer of the adrenal gland as well. And the outer layer of the adrenal gland secretes 25 different hormones. So a lot of stuff is secreted from there. But I'm only wanting you to know two, because I think that life is difficult as it is. We don't need to make life more difficult. So from the cortex, there's two hormones. And the first one that we're going to have a look is aldosterone. aldosterone plays role in many, many, many processes. And again, would I expect you to know these processes in detail? No, just that you know that there is such a hormone and it does a lot of things. It regulates the kidney function, energy production as part of the ATPase, blood pressure, plasma concentration, urination. So it does a lot of things that increases the functions of these processes that we find in the body. And the clinical importance was when we have aldosteronism, that's too much aldosterone being produced. So then all of these would be happening at a very, very high rate, and that wouldn't be great either. If your kidneys are working like crazy, if you're producing energy like crazy, your blood pressure is like crazy, your plasma concentration, urination, all these. So that's an example of a clinical issue, but we don't have enough time on this course to really dive into studying these clinical issues in great detail. But as long as you know aldosterone, and you remember when we talked about the pancreas, and I said with the pancreas, I'm going to come back to this in a second, that there were two hormones that I wanted you to know, insulin and glucagon. Now I have words that seem very much like glucagon, don't they? Glucocorticoids. And examples of glucocorticoids contain the cortisol, hydrocortisone, cortisone, corticosterone, so many different kinds. But glucocorticoids are a group of hormones that act on regulating the metabolism, regulating our stress responses, and regulating glucose regulation as well. So there is a reason why we're hearing this word, but remember that glucocorticoids are all to do with the adrenal gland, not with the pancreas. That's the toughest question that I'm going to have in the exam. So just not to get confused by those words. For the medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland, we had two hormones that were important, epinephrine and norepinephrine. These increase your heart rate and redirect the blood to new parts of the body. And why would we want to get our heart rate up? Why would we want to redirect our blood? And in this case, we're redirecting the blood, for example, to the muscles, big skeletal muscles. Well, we do that because we're preparing ourselves for fighting or flighting from a situation. So we're preparing for a stressful situation. So that was all to do with the sympathetic branch of autonomic nervous system. So these two hormones are important for that. And sometimes we might then in clinical use, for example, EpiPen and so on. But for these purposes, we just want to know epinephrine and norepinephrine. They were the hormones from the medulla, from the middle of the adrenal. I hope that those were okay. Am I jumping too much? Are you having a hard time looking where I'm supposed to be? No, just give me a shout out that stop if I'm going too fast. Now the rest of this list of glands that we have is going to be really quick and really easy. I'd like us to talk a little bit about gonads, and gonads were basically our ovaries and testes, just a general name for the both. And you remember that their function is to produce sex hormones. For females, the ovaries produce two kinds of hormones that are very important for us, estrogen and progesterone. These are female hormones from the ovaries. And this clinical importance that I put here, that's not important for you to know. That's just referring because we were talking in the class about the drug development and how we test it on men because you can sacrifice men easily. There's many of us to be spread around. So no, because the female menstrual cycle was much more complicated. Females are more complicated than men are. So we did the tests on men for the first. But that's not really the main point that I want you to get out of that. I just want you to know that two hormones from ovaries would be the estrogen and progesterone. For the males, from the testes, we get the testosterone. And that's the level that you would need to know. I could do in the exam, for example, that I would have different glands, and then I would have different hormones, and I'd be like, can you match the gland and the hormone together? And I think that these would be really easy ones to match. You won't think that where else could testosterone be than testes. Hopefully. So that's the level of detail that I want you to worry. Not making it any more difficult than it has to. Then we talk about the kidneys. And remember again, whenever we talk about kidneys and we want to be fancy, we want to work in the medical field, we use the word renal. So you don't have a kidney doctor, you have a renal doctor. And you don't have kidney sciences, you have renal sciences. But it's the same thing. We're just wanting to sound very smart. That's all that anatomy and physiology is. You trick people to think that you know more than you do. So what kidneys do, the main function of the kidneys was regulation of the blood pressure. And this regulation of the blood pressure in kidneys is done through one hormone, and this hormone was renin. So renin regulates the blood pressure within the kidneys. And a lot of blood pressure medications, for example, act on the kidneys. So that's a kind of a big one. Often, again, we get distracted and we think that kidneys would be all to do with urine and urination. No, it's more that happens as well, but it's more to do with blood pressure regulation. But the hormone that I want you to remember when we talk about kidneys is the renin. The next one that I have on this list is one that often gets overlooked. And the reason why I have listed it there is because A, I think it's important, but B, because I've done a lot of research on that hormone as well. The hormone is known as leptin, and this leptin hormone is secreted from the fat cells, adipose cells in the body. And the function of leptin is to control one's appetite. So you might remember on that video I told about this experiment that we did with mice. And one set of mice, we removed their ability to produce leptin, or we removed their ability to have receptors for leptin. So when you have no leptin in the body, you don't have any control over your appetite. You will just keep eating and eating and eating. And in case of these mice, to the point that they ate themselves until they explode. Not quite as dramatically, don't think of it, wasn't like cartoon, but they do eat themselves sick. So leptin is really important hormone in regulating the appetite. And if we think of treatments, for example, for obesity, that could be a hormone that we could consider as a treatment strategy. We also have sometimes people who are excessively obese, and they're not obese because they have bad habits or they do this or that. It's because they're lacking this hormone leptin. So they never feel like they'd be full. And just by simply administering this hormone, all of a sudden, they can easily gain normal BMI. They get back to the normal range in terms of the weight and so on. So leptin is an interesting hormone in that sense. Another hormone that you might have heard is melatonin. And melatonin is secreted from our pineal gland. You remember pineal gland was located at the third ventricle here inside the brain. I normally try to do on my 201 with students at least some dissections of the sheep brain. I don't know, did you get a chance to play? If you looked into the sheep brain, you could actually see at the back the pea-looking structure, the pineal gland there. If you didn't get the chance to do that, I actually have that video on my YouTube channel, so you can also check it out. I can share it as a post. I'm all about let's get something that lets us see these structures, but it is there hidden deep within the brain, the pineal gland, and its function is to secrete melatonin. And melatonin is all about regulating the sleep-wake cycle. So you might have seen people who have issues with falling asleep, have insomnia, or have other problems. They might take supplementary melatonin. You're like, I'm here. Yeah. So some of this melatonin is over-the-counter, and then we have stronger stuff that can be also prescribed. I am with you that I have sleep trouble, but usually my sleep trouble is because I'm traveling from one continent to another, crossing multiple time zones. So I just drug myself up, so I fall asleep. I really shouldn't say this next one is just a joke, trust me. I believe in happiness through pharmacology. My life is so much better because I can write prescriptions for myself. No. But anyway, so melatonin, all about regulating the sleep-wake cycle. Again, if I think, what could I ask about this in an exam? I could try to bring in words that sound like melatonin, but are not melatonin. You might remember melanin from when you talked about the skin. That's not a hormone, but that would be really good way of testing students. Can they tell what melanin and melatonin are? Or Melania Trump, because I just had to throw it in there. I don't know why. But again, don't fall for the easy tricks that I might try by putting other words that make no sense but sound similar. If you're feeling in doubt which of those words was the right, you've got your nice diagram that you can refer to. And if you've completed that, you can be like, oh, I remember. It was the melatonin that we wanted to know. Does that sound okay? I know that it's a lot of information, but we're almost done. We get back to our good old friend, pancreas. So again, we talk about hormones. Pancreas secreted two different hormones, insulin and glucagon. Their function was to regulate the blood sugar levels. I would want you to know for the exam the clinical importance, which is of course type 1 and type 2 diabetes. You remember type 1 diabetes was all to do with the fact that you're usually born with this, and either your body does not produce at all insulin, or your body does not produce enough insulin. And how do we treat diabetes type 1? Well, we end up doing many different things, but usually that also includes having to inject synthetic insulin into the body of the patient. Patients self-administer that. Diabetes type 2, then again, we often describe it as a late onset diabetes. That's what you usually get later in life, and is much more to do with the lifestyle choices, and treatment of that can as well include just management of lifestyle choices. So that would be a good question in the exam, that do we know what's type 1, what's type 2 diabetes? Remember, the questions are only 2 points each, so it's just 2 points out of 100. It's not a big deal if you miss one question here or there, but I want to make sure that you get each question right. Well, the next one that we're going to have a look of is going to be our parathyroid glands. And it's weird that we're talking about parathyroid glands before we have talked about thyroid. But that's because I put them in alphabetical order. There's no logic into this, anything else than that. But parathyroid glands were these tiny yellow-brownish glands that were within the thyroid gland. Really, in real human body, human cadaver, human corpse, it's hard to tell them apart. We might need to do some histological analysis or some staining, but they are there. And at this level, we just accept that they're tiny glands within the thyroid. Parathyroid gland produces, surprise, surprise, parathyroid hormone. It's like the easiest matching question if I put that, hey, where would you match parathyroid hormone? You should not miss that question. And the function of the parathyroid hormone, the main function is calcium regulation, calcium homeostasis. And what we notice when we study different physiological processes within the body is that calcium is everywhere in the body. So calcium is an important one, and that's regulated by the parathyroid gland and parathyroid hormone. I've listed some other clinical examples there, but I really wouldn't worry too much about it. The second last one that I have here is our thymus. And thymus is a little weird because when I think of human body, I want to see the structure. I'm kind of like, if I can't see it, it's not worth me learning it, which is totally wrong. You should never think of like that. Histology is really important, but I'm an anatomist by training, and I did postmortems for a big chunk of my life, and I'm all about things that I can see with naked eye, and I can feel them, I can touch them. So thymus is a difficult one in older people. In people of our age, and then people from our age onwards. When you go and look at the catheter and cut them open, the thymus, which would be located just above the heart, we often don't find it there. And that's because thymus shrinks over age. We end up noticing that on newborns, the thymus is huge in relation to their body, but then it shrinks. And what happens is that thymus gets replaced by adipose tissue and connective tissue. But that doesn't mean that thymus would stop working. Thymus still functions. And thymus, the function of that was to do with producing T cells. And T cells are cells that are going to be really important when we look at immune system. So at this point, all you need to know is that thymus makes T cells. That's all you need to know. We'll talk about what these T cells are and what their function are when we look at the immune system later on. But thymus shrinks over age, hard to find on an adult. And the last one that we have a look of is the thyroid gland. You remember thyroid is higher than the thymus. It's located at the anterior neck, just below the voice box, below the Adam's apple. Because I'm an anatomist, I always like to describe what things like, and I have very good imagination. I think it looks a little bit like a butterfly, but I don't know. Are there butterflies that look like that? Maybe it's just my good imagination. But it has two lobes, and then it's connected from the middle by a structure called isthmus. So, well, you can describe it with whatever shape you wish. I would not expect you to agree that it looks like butterfly. But what thyroid gland does, it produces hormone called T3, which then gets converted to a hormone called T4. And the function of these hormones is to regulate metabolism. So it's all about how we use energy. How much energy do we need? So if you have a situation where you have overactive thyroid, your metabolic rate might be super fast, that you eat and you eat and you eat and you can't put on weight or even maintain weight. Or if you have thyroid gland that's very underactive, it might be that you don't even eat that much, but because you've got such a slow metabolism as a result of the underactive thyroid, you just maintain a lot of weight easily. So a lot of the time when I had patients who came to the practice, to the clinical practice, and they were like, oh, I'm having issues with losing weight. A lot of the time they do propose that it could be thyroid gland, that maybe they have issues with that, and it can be. Managing thyroid gland issues, that's quite tricky. It's really a balancing act to find the right amount of supplementary T3, T4. That's something that's never kind of a finished project. We end up having to juggle with that quite a bit. there was a disease, and out of these diseases, I do want you to know for the exam, just as a name, the Graves' disease. Graves' disease was associated with the thyroid gland, and that was where we had someone who had a high metabolism, they were sweating, their heart rate was high, heart rate was also irregular, they appeared nervous, they were like really psyched, and they were losing weight. So that's all to do with issues with the thyroid gland. So I would know that for the exam. Again, it's only 2-point question. It's not a big deal, but you can kind of make a connection that, oh, Graves' disease, that's got something to do with the thyroid. Then the rest of the handout for the hormones is kind of reviewing more of the theoretical background. And that gives you a clue that I am going to be asking in the exam also this theoretical background, not just the glands. So there's some very basic stuff, and I'm going to go through this a little quicker, but if you do want, we can stop wherever you need that. What is a hormone? Well, hormone, I have a definition here. It's a long-distance chemical signal that travels in blood or lymph. There's many ways of defining, but that would be a nice exercise that I would give you definition for a hormone, definition for autocrine, and definition for paracrine. And I would ask that, can you match them with the right terms? So you remember hormones traveled everywhere in the body in the bloodstream, whereas autocrines are secreted by a cell, and those hormones or those chemicals act on the very same cell again. So it secretes something for itself. That's called autocrine. Think of autopilot. Autopilot does it for itself. So autocrine does it for itself as well. I don't know, I just always try to think of these words that help me to remember. If it doesn't make any sense, don't let me confuse you. Or if you have automatic machine, it does it for itself. So autocrine cells, chemicals secreted for the very same cell. Paracrines are something in between of an autocrine and hormone. They are secreted from one cell, and they don't act on the particular cell, but they act on the cells very close to that cell. So they're locally acting chemicals. So they're not quite hormones, they're not quite autocrines. So matching those definitions and terms would be a really good exam question. I really don't have too much to say about the chemical structure of the hormones. We talked about it in the lecture material, so I added it there, but I don't think, I would struggle to think of a good exam question out of that. I've added there cholesterol just because students are like, oh, cholesterol makes steroids, so I need to eat food that's high in cholesterol. No, you don't. You get all the cholesterol that you need from your body naturally. You don't need to get it from diet. So that's just for that reason. It has no bigger meaning. There's no bigger secret on it. But the next kind of a subheading that I have is an important one. And that's an important one because that's a very fundamental question that we're going to be asking. We're going to be asking that since we have hormones, and these hormones traveled in the bloodstream to everywhere, why don't all the cells in the body then also start doing whatever that hormone is supposed to make them do? Like if we have a hormone that's responsible for regulating our thyroid gland, we have thyroid stimulating hormone that's being secreted. Why doesn't thyroid stimulating hormone also start doing on your business on your toes or on your abdomen? Well, there's a very good reason, because although hormones travel everywhere, hormones only act on cells if those cells have receptors for that particular hormone. So that was when we thought about the key and lock mechanism, that the hormone must be a perfect match with the receptor. So they are very, very specific. The hormone receptor connection, the hormone receptor match must be perfect for an action to occur. So it's all about where do we find these receptors. And what does a hormone do when it binds into a receptor? Well, it somehow changes what that cell does. That's all I'm trying to say there with the action. You don't need to worry about the examples. I again went crazy thinking of everything that I could think of. But really the big deal is that if we have a hormone that binds to a receptor, well, that causes some sort of a change in that cell. That's the big story. And the next one is going to be important, and I'll tell you why it's important. So don't just be like, oh, I need to remember all of it. We need to remember that hormones needed to get to contact with the receptor in order to do their business. Well, we have certain hormones that are known as water-soluble and certain hormones that are known as lipid-soluble. Well, if something's water-soluble, it's not going to be able to pass through the cell membrane. We remember cell membrane was known as a plasma membrane. So if we have a water-soluble hormone, it's not going to be able to go inside the cell. So water-soluble hormones must have receptors on the outside of the cell. And then when a water-soluble hormone binds into that receptor on the outside of the cell, there must be some sort of a messenger, secondary messenger that passes the message inside the cell to make the cell do whatever it's meaning to do then when the hormone comes there. Often it is activation of some sort of a gene or changing the activity of that cell. But remember, water-soluble hormones, they have to act on the cell membrane, and they rely on other messengers inside the cell then to do whatever the message is that we want to transport. Well, lipid-soluble hormones are different then. If we think if something's lipid-soluble, it's going to be able to cross that cell membrane. It's going to be able to enter inside the cell. So lipid-soluble hormones can go inside the cell, and there they can directly do whatever their business is. They don't need secondary messengers. They're able to do it themselves. So they enter the cell, and inside the cell we have a receptor for a lipid-soluble hormone, and that then activates genes or changes the cell's activity or whatever is the goal of that hormone, but it does it directly. I hope that makes sense, kind of. Keep it simple. You're like, oh my God, there's so much notes. Don't break your arm for writing for that. Keep the big picture on your mind. I added a table underneath it, just in case if someone falls in love with this concept, they can read more about it, because I had typed that table. That's basically why I added it. It's a really bad reason, but that's why I did it. It's actually from your slides. I've included it back in there. The next one is going to be a revision for us. The concept of homeostasis. And I tell you, if you study with me, even on microbiome, we keep looking at the same graph again and again and again, because it's so good. It so simplifies. We find in textbooks many different ways of explaining this, but this is the most simple that I've ever seen. What is homeostasis? Well, one way to define it is that homeostasis is all about maintaining consistent internal environment. So we want to keep things the same inside an organism or whatever we're looking in terms of the homeostasis. And how homeostasis works, we have basically 4 steps in a process. And everything starts with the stimulus. So within the homeostatic feedback loop, we have something that changes. So stimulus is that body responds to changes. Body really doesn't respond if things remain the same. If you think of poking someone with a pen, initially they'll be irritated, but eventually they'll be just like, oh, well, that happens. And you become desensitized for that. Or if you put your hands to hot water when you're washing dishes, or you go to cold lake to swim. Initially it feels cold, but then you stop feeling that cold because you become desensitized for that. So body is all about changes. If there is a change of some kind that's important for us, in this example, we could think of, for example, body temperature. Your body temperature is dropping. You're getting cold. That's the stimulus. You have to sense that somehow. And we would have, in this case, thermoreceptors that would tell that, oh, okay, it's getting cold here. My body is getting cooler. Well, sensor can just tell that, but it doesn't do any processing with this information. Sensors pass this message to the control center, which is usually in us, our brain. And within the control center, we have a set point, a set of ranges that's acceptable, that, okay, your body temperature should remain between these temperatures. If it's too high or if it's too low, it's dangerous and we want to bring it back to where it is. And what control center does, you can think of the set point a little bit like the control unit of the AC, that you have the range what you want the AC to be. And if we go off from that, then we have to act on it. An effector kicks in. So effector normally stops the stimulus from happening. And that's the line that has a line at the top. It stops the stimulus from happening. I think that that's more of from electrical engineering symbols, but I stole it from there because I did. So that's negative feedback. We're getting too cold and we're sensing that, we're passing that message to the brain, there we're noticing that we're deviating from our set point, we're telling effector that stop us from getting too cold. What sort of responses could you have through effector? You could start to shiver, which is muscles working, producing heat. You could behave by going to a warm room or putting more clothes on or whatever, things like that. Sometimes we do get positive feedback. We had 3 cases where we saw positive feedback in humans: childbirth, lactation, and blood clotting. Those are the only 3 ones that I know and I can think of where we would see positive feedback in human body. So that would be a really good question, wouldn't it be, that I listed that, oh, pick out of this list of questions examples that are examples of positive feedback or examples that are examples of negative feedback. So underneath there, I've listed that negative feedback stopped something from happening, whereas positive feedback promoted that to happen even further. The next one, I really don't think that there's much of information there. It's just to say that hormones can be released because another hormone tells that hormone to be released, or hormones can be released because a nervous system tells that hormone to be released. It's like a really fancy way to say that. That's all you need to know about it. And we have very little to go on this chapter anymore, and the blood chapter is super easy. So we feel good about this? Yes? There can be 3 reasons that kind of affect that how much activation takes place. It can be that, do we have a lot of the hormone present or do we have little of the hormone present? Do we have many receptors or only few receptors present? And also how tightly the hormone and receptor bind together. Those 3 characteristics, those 3 factors control that how much activation we end up seeing. And you remember that we always kind of responded to changes. Constant values were not that interesting for us. So up and down regulation would be good terms to know for the exam. You remember when you had up regulation, we're talking about a situation where there's very little of a hormone in the blood. And because there's so little of that hormone and we still want to be able to sense when that hormone is released, what could we do to compensate for that? Well, let's put out more receptors on those cells. So we upregulate the amount of receptors. So receptor number is brought up. So that's why it's upregulation. If we have loads and loads and loads of hormone in the body, and we're kind of like, okay, it's really easy to sense this hormone because there's so much of it around, we don't really need to have that many receptors, so we can actually downregulate the amount of receptors that are present. So we have less receptors as a result of downregulation. So that's as simple as that. I think that the next one is again me just kind of trying to repeat something that's not really difficult concept. I've just worded it in a weird way. So what I've done, I've worded that hormones can be in blood either free or bound to something. That's it. That's all I'm wanting to say. That hormones can be floating in the blood free, or then they are bound to something. And what causes the concentration of the hormone, whether we have a lot of hormone or we have a little of hormone, we can consider it as a balance of how much hormone we're making and how much hormone we're taking away. And we want these two to be balanced. So we have constant amount of that hormone. There comes an important term that would be a good term to know for the exam. The term is half-life. Half-life of a hormone tells us how long time it takes for the amount of that hormone to be decreased by half. Because you remember, not all hormones remain in the body forever. We eventually start to remove the hormone when we no longer need it, because otherwise we would just end up building more and more and more hormones in our body and we would go crazy. So hormones get removed or inactivated over time. And half-life gives us an idea that how long time it takes for half of those hormones, that hormone to be removed. And the very last concept is again terms and definitions. So we have interactions. Sometimes one hormone isn't just acting. There might be multiple hormones that are acting. And examples of that we have here is permissiveness, when one hormone needs another hormone to be present so that the initial hormone can even act on wherever it needs to act. Synergism, when we have synergy, presence of one hormone increases the effect of the initial hormone of the interest. And then antagonism, when we have a hormone and another hormone comes, and the fact that that other hormone came, it actually decreases or stops that initial hormone from acting. So just know those terms, know those so you can match a definition and you can match the term. And again, those are going to be on your notes and the video is going to be available. I know we've gone now over time. Do you want to wrap it up here or do you want to have a look through the blood? The blood is very quick and very short.
I feel pretty good about the blood.
Yeah.
I still have a couple of assignments due tonight for another class that I have to finish up.
But don't worry, like I said, if you need extension, if you need anything, just let me know. I'm all about that. I want you to get those points. With the blood, it's much more simple than the hormones. Really, we're going to be looking at the 3 different chapters, which all together make the cardiovascular system. And we started with the blood. But one thing that I would know about the blood, it's connective tissue. It's a special type of connective tissue. It's not like bone. It's not like ligaments. It's not like tendons. It's a liquid connective tissue, but it still connects different parts. It transports stuff. Blood is made at the red bone marrow. These terms I would know when we talk about poiesis. Poiesis was making of something. So we had a hematopoiesis that referred just to general blood. Making of general blood was known as a hematopoiesis. And I also told you that there's about 8% of the body weight of blood. And that's about 5 liters in a typical human being. I think that in imperial scale, that's something like 1.3 gallons. I'm guessing. I'm not very good with anything else than metric system. Rest of the world uses metric system. You guys are difficult here in America. The clinical relevance is that when we take a blood sample from an individual and we then throw that blood sample into a test tube, we spin it in a centrifuge, the components of the blood separate based on their weight. The lightest stuff, which is our plasma, goes to the top. The heaviest stuff, which is our red blood cells, goes to the bottom. And just by that, we can already tell a lot about the health of an individual. So in very challenging environments, in environments of the third world countries, even this test tells us a lot about the individual. And these functions I would know. I group the functions of the blood in 3 groups. Blood plays a role in transportation of various gases, nutrients, wastes, hormones. Blood plays a role also in regulating, for example, the fluid balance, pH, heat. And also blood had a role in the protective functions, immunity, immune system, blood clotting, and so on. Really, we talked already about spinning the blood sample. We remember most of the blood is plasma, about 55%. That's a stickier than water, kind of a straw-colored yellowish liquid. And there's a lot of proteins in the plasma. That's all you need to know about it. Then in addition, you had formed elements which were all these cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So red blood cells, the fancy word for those is erythrocytes. So when we talk about making of red blood cells, we talk about erythropoiesis. So you see why knowing these terms would be useful. So you know what blood cell we're talking about. About 45% of the volume of the blood is red blood cells. What does a red blood cell look like? It's like this balloon that had been squashed from the middle, not quite like a donut all the way through, but close to that. So it's described as biconcave disc. Red blood cells don't have nucleus. Red blood cells don't have cell organelles. And I always tell you that cells must have a nucleus. How is this possible? Well, at some stage of the development of the red blood cell, it loses its nucleus, it loses its cell organelles. And that kind of makes sense. If there was, for example, lots of mitochondria, the red blood cell would use all the oxygen that it's supposed to be carrying. So that's why it's simple. Each red blood cell contained 4 hemoglobin units. And whether there's oxygen or there's no oxygen defined the color of the blood. If it's really high in oxygen, it's really bright red. If it's very low in oxygen, it's kind of darker blue, purplish. I said that carbon monoxide poisoning, that based on the fact that carbon monoxide takes the place of the oxygen in those hemoglobin subunits. So now we run out of oxygen in the body, and that's why people die. You can have too much red blood cells, then we're talking about hypoxia. Or too little red blood cells, that's hypoxia. If there's too much, that makes just the blood very high in viscosity. What controlled a hormone? This would be a good one to know. A hormone that controls red blood cell production, erythropoietin, EPO. And erythropoietin was secreted when there's little red blood cells or little oxygen around. An example of that would be living in high altitude. But you can also take that as a drug, and that would be cheating in the sports. But if you have a lot of red blood cells, you're able to transport a lot of oxygen to the muscles, so you're theoretically able to perform better than your competition. Remember also, we need to get iron from our diet to be able to produce red blood cells. They live about 100, 120 days, and then are broken into different elements that can be reused. I mentioned when there's low amounts of oxygen, we have anemia. This is going to be your extra credit question. What is sickle cell anemia, and why is it useful? You remember sickle cell anemia was a result of just a single base being different in the DNA. And that single base caused one amino acid difference, which caused the red blood cell to be totally different in shape. It looked like a half moon, or it looked like a sickled cell. And that had a problem because then sickle cells don't carry as much oxygen, and they get caught in the smaller blood vessels, whereas normal red blood cells just squeeze through nicely. So you could say that sickle cell anemia is not a great thing, but we end up realizing that sickle cell anemia, where we look at where it's common in sub-Saharan Africa, but at the very same area where it's common, also malaria is common. And we realized that malaria parasite, to do its job, it has to be able to enter the red blood cell. Well, turns out if you have sickled red blood cells, malaria parasite cannot enter those cells. So it's almost like a protective function against malaria. So although having sickle cell anemia is not great, it might save you from malaria. So that would be your extra credit question. Now to tell a little bit about that. Don't worry too much, just like a very basic couple of sentences. And then we had our white blood cells. White blood cells, all you need to know, they're all about defending against diseases. And I wanted you to remember that, use the mnemonic, never let monkeys eat bananas. That tells you which white blood cell is the most common, which one is least common. So neutrophils are most common, basophils are least common. So just the sentence, never let monkeys eat bananas, that tells you the order of those white blood cells. Production of the white blood cells, leukopoiesis. And then leukemia is if you have too much white blood cells, leukopenia when you have too little white blood cells. And platelets were the last thing. That was all about the clotting of the blood. They are fragments of the cells and they only survive for about 10 days in the body. And that's it. Then we talked about blood types and we went through how to make these tables, and we noticed that anyone who has blood type AB could receive blood from anyone, and anyone who had blood type O could donate their blood to anyone. That's all there is to this test. And some people were asking me in terms of the lab practical. There's also a study guide for it that I put together this morning. So just have a look that you can find, you can identify those structures that are listed on that study. That's all you need to know. If you have any questions, you can ask now, you can ask later, but really the questions are at the level that I just told you. And I told you the most difficult questions. The questions are simpler than that. So if you complete this one, this study guide, you've got answer to every single question in an exam. Sounds good. Do you have any questions? I know that it was a lot.
I like hearing that we are prepared for every question. It is like a stress reliever.
Good. I don't want you to stress. I really want you to succeed. I promise that your success is just as important for me as it is for you, probably even more so. I still want to keep this job as a side hustle, so I'm probably more nervous than you are. So like I said, I have then study guide for the labs. I have practice chance for you also with the lab practical. So you can go and practice that lab as many times as you wish. What kind of that test is going to be, it doesn't affect your final grade, but it gives you a chance kind of to get to the hang of what to expect. So have a look of that in your Canvas shell. And I added the lecture slides of every chapter because someone was asking that, and I had a little bit of chasing so I didn't break any copyrights. So I had to, that's why it took me a little while so I don't get into trouble. I'm happy to help you if you have any questions while you're preparing for the exam. We also have the tutors available, but don't feel that there's no help. I'm definitely to help you. I know that I've been super busy and super useless with my emails, but I am now available, and don't give up. Like if you say that, hey, I haven't heard, I will respond. It's just been, I do quite a few different schools, and I have something else that I was doing regarding to the issues that we've seen with the discrimination and so on. So that's taken a lot of my time. And we've covered everything that we set out to do. I know that was a lot. You deserve a good night's sleep. Don't worry, you've got this. And like I said, if you want any assignments opened, drop me a message or however you wish to contact me. I will open those for you because I want you to get every single one of those points.
Okay. I really want to study the like each white blood cell. I would like to study their appearance. That's something that definitely needs to be worked on.
That's something that I think is really well explained in the video my colleague Dr. Greer did on that anatomy of the blood. Look through what she did, and then I listed pretty much what she said in the study guide. And if you keep those next to you while you watch her video, you'll actually be able to tell apart those white blood cells. I'm going to be honest, I studied all this back in the day. Would I remember now if someone asked me out of the blue? I would probably be able to classify them, but it would take me some effort. But these are the things that you learn, you know how to do, but then are you going to use it in your everyday life? You might if you go to that field. But if you don't, if you're like me, that you work just with dead people, I don't care if they have it or not.
That's very cool.
Only the blood.
Exactly. I just drain all the blood and just put embalming. That's my way of dealing with difficult concepts. No, but I really do think that you're going to do better than you expect.
Awesome.
Okay.
Great.
Well,
Have a
thank
good
you so
night.
much.
Thank you.
I appreciate
And then
it.
I will email you after we get off of this for those assignments.
Perfect. And I'll set them up. And if you do want that we look together, because I will also have to look at what needs to be done, I'm available this week all the time. So you tell me when it's good for you, and I will make myself available.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Right, thank you.
Take care of
Thank
yourself.
you.
Get rest. Don't stress.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Bye.
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 Sam.